This is Larry Hayward, pastor of Westminster Presbyterian Church in Alexandria, Virginia. To let you in on some of the sausage making of sermons, one of the discarded paragraphs of Sunday's sermon was focused on an uncorrected typo that I made in drafting it. If you will recall, the title and theme verse of the sermon was, "The testimony of God is greater." The point of the sermon was that God's testimony to our hearts concerning decisions we make or have made, as rare and as difficult as it can be for us to discern God's testimony, but his testimony is greater than the human testimonies we receive from the advice of friends, support from counselors, sermons we hear, books we read, even our understanding and interpretations of biblical texts. The testimony of God is greater than even these. But the typo that I made left out the T in greater. So when I was saying the sermon out loud orally at home, I came to that sentence and I read aloud, "The testimony of God is greater." Now, granted, Grayer and Graer are two different spellings, and the latter isn't even a word. But there's a world of difference between saying the testimony of God is greater than any human testimony and saying the testimony of God is greater than any human testimony. They are miles apart in meaning. In our Calvinist heritage, we have a strong emphasis on the sovereignty, majesty, power, transcendence of God. Because of God's majesty, it is challenging for us to discern God's will, to know God's ways, even to recognize when God may be revealing God's self to us. We rarely err on the side of God being our best friend, our conversation partner. By the same token, we live in a lot of gray areas of life, in our families, in our work, in our civic affairs and politics. We often have trouble deciding. But whatever grayness we experience in our decision making lies with our less than full capacity as human beings to know God and discern God's will. I believe that God understands what we face, understands that sometimes our choices are often between the lesser of two or three evils, understands that we live in gray areas. But that doesn't mean that God himself is gray. When we receive God's testimony, when we sense in our hearts that we know the way God is leading us, the testimony God has revealed is not grayer than human testimony, but is in fact greater than human testimony, which by its very nature is pretty gray. So you can see why I eliminated this paragraph from the sermon. It became way too complicated. But what I want to conclude with is this. In James 1:17, the King James Version reads this way: "Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, and cometh down from the Father of lights, with whom is no variableness, neither shadow of turning." We may rarely have the capacity to see the testimony of God clearly, but it is comforting to know that God's testimony is always greater, not grayer. Amen.